represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESG CV Past Trainings webpage. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: ESG resources, ESG CV updates, office hours update, upcoming trainings, ESG Q&A, and today's spotlight session, procurement best practices. Next slide. And now I will turn it over to Connie.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to let everyone know that we will be issuing in September, we're calling a one-time special homelessness prevention NOFA. And the funds that will be used for this one-time NOFA are from our disencumbered 2020 allocation. We have about $1.7 million. And we chose homelessness prevention as the activity that we would make available under this NOFA, because we felt there was still a need. Most of the eviction moratoriums and programs were lifted and ended last summer. So we felt like this $1.7 million that we had in leftover funds, homelessness prevention would be a good place to develop a NOFA. So just a few highlights of this special NOFA. We're going to make it over the counter. So that means first in, first reviewed, and we'll just keep the funding open until we run out of funds. The requirement here is that every applicant must have approved homelessness prevention policies and procedures. Now, there's only about 5 organizations right now that have approved with us their HP policies and procedures. However, if you're interested in applying under this NOFA and you don't have approved HP policies yet, you can send them in with the application when we release the application in NOFA in September. We will review those and provide any feedback and so forth so you can go forward. But that is one requirement. Do you have any questions as far as what goes into an approved HP policy and procedures document? Please reach out to your representative, or you can reach out to me and we'll be happy to get you some information. The funds will expire in September 7th of 2024. So that's why we want to get this out to you, so you would have a year to go ahead and utilize this funding. Next slide, please. So a couple other highlights about this. If you're interested in applying and you feel like, hey, you have a need for some rental assistance, that you have some folks that are at risk of losing their housing, and of course, all the ESG federal regs would still apply. So we're going to make the application very, very simple as far as streamlined for you, so it's not real cumbersome. So you still have to have a resolution, narrative saying why and where in your COC service area that you're going to focus this funding. And if you have any supporting documents about eviction rates or anything that would support why you feel that you want to come in and you want to receive the funding for homelessness prevention, will also be required. But why I'm presenting today is really to just get a read and kind of feel for the interest in this NOFA, and is there a need in your community for this type of funding, and how many of you would be interested in applying for this funding. Again, it's going to be over the counter, and if you want to give us some feedback, please write to the ESG NOFA inbox. You can write to me. you can write to any of your, if you want to go through your ESG representative. This is for annual ESG. This is not CV. This is annual ESG. And again, more to come on that, but I just want to give everybody a heads up what's coming down the road. We're really excited about getting this funding out to you. And I will turn it back over to you, Shavana.
Shavana, before you take back over, Connie, we have a question from Trisha. And
Okay.
she's asking, will this NOFA be applied at the COC level or county level?
So the eligible applicants, you're not going to do a recommendation package or anything. If eligible applicants would be nonprofits, any eligible applicants under the federal rate. So nonprofits, cities or counties can apply for this. We're not going to have this, it's not going to be a balance of state that sends in a recommendation package for an applicant. So that's how we're handling this. Does that answer your question as far as? Okay. And again, Trisha or anybody else, if you want to talk further about it, I'd love to talk with you about it. Send me an email, drop an email in the NOFA box, and those that are monitoring that box will make sure that I get it. Any other questions?
Don't see any others. And we'll go ahead and just pass it to Tony now.
Okay.
Thanks, Connie. Good morning, everyone. No new updates, just a few quick reminders. The 2022 ESG contracts have begun routing. The 2023 ESG annual NOFA will be released in mid-July, and the contract expenditure deadline for the 2021 contracts is August 31st, 2023. Next slide, please. So as always, please check our policy document webpage, always being updated. Next slide, please. And reach out to your team representatives if you have any questions or the NOFA inbox. Thank you so much. Back to you,
Thank you,
Giovanna.
Anthony and Connie. ESG CV updates, reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention must be expended by September the 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October the 31st, 2023. Final requests for funds, your RFFs, must be submitted to the department by November the 15th, 2023. Next slide, please. Reminders while planning for your ESG CV closeout. Spend down timing. Know when you're approaching the end. Know that most funds are due to be spent by September the 30th, 2023. So don't spend too fast, but time it right. Funding continuity. Consider HAP funding and other funding streams that will allow you to continue to serve clients after closeout. Closing intake. Set dates and deadlines to stop accepting clients, client intakes, and prepare final rapid rehousing assistance. Staffing issues. Just like we need to make sure we are not leaving participants with nowhere to go, we also need to make sure we are thinking of ways to keep staff employed. Client issues. Make sure you involve and inform participants timely before assistance ends so they can prepare as well. No client should become homeless because a program is closing. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hour topics. There will be no office hours on July the 5th. July the 12th, ESG CV closeout and disposition of ESG CV equipment. Next slide, please. The new links for training site and past trainings. The links will be included in the slide deck when emailed. Next slide, please. Upcoming trainings. Please use these resources as needed. The links will also be included in the slide deck. Next slide, please. At this time, are there any questions? We also would like to remind you to please put your questions in the chat, and you may continue to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. And I see there are no questions, so next slide, please. How to contact us. If you have further questions, please contact your annual ESG representative or email esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And please reach out to your grant administrator for ESGCV. Next slide, please. Now, let's turn our attention for today's Spotlight series on procurement best practices with David Munoz.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome everybody and good morning. Thank you, Shavana. As she indicated, today's office hours presentation is going to be about procurement best practices. Procurement is definitely an item that most of you all will deal with as it relates to federal programs and grants. And while we don't utilize the word procurement in our day-to-day lives, we do carry out procurement actions very frequently throughout our daily lives. And an example of that is when you walk into, let's say, a gas station mini mart, and you're looking for a water, and you see an entire refrigerator filled with different brands of water at different price levels. You could go with your kind of Nestle, really affordable. You could go all the way up to something like a Voss and pay a lot more. Depending on what you're looking for, you're going to make that decision. But you are then assessing kind of three different, categories of prices for that water bottle and deciding which is, the most reasonably priced or within your budget. And then you'll pick up the Nestle water bottle and pay your $1.50 and get on with it. But in essence, you are going to be doing, or you should be doing, that same exercise of comparing the costs for the same good when you're utilizing federal funds. So anytime you're purchasing supplies, equipment, or you are paying for services and entering into a contract, you want to be able to compare and contrast what is available in the marketplace, which vendors can provide you those goods and services, and at what price point. Next slide, please. So to that end, we will have kind of 4 sections to today's office hours presentation. We'll start off with the principles or purpose for procurement, which is really kind of that good value and fair and open competition. Oh, we can go back one. Then we'll kind of move into the 2 primary procurement methods, which is formal and informal. We'll follow that up with the informal procurement methods. So micro purchases, small purchases, and then we'll finish it off with formal procurement methods, which again, there are 2, which would be kind of your sealed bids and competitive proposals. Next slide, please. So with respect to the procurement principles, there are 2 main reasons why procurement is kind of required. The first is to ensure that federal funds are utilized to purchase goods and services that have a good value, especially since they are, taxpayer funds. And the second is to ensure that when we're purchasing goods and services, we are kind of fostering a fair and open competitive environment. As it relates to kind of good value and good use of funds, it really comes down to being able to verify and document that a cost is reasonable. A lot of folks may have questions and, how do you determine what is reasonable? It's a bit subjective. There could be kind of a moving goalpost. And what HUD has kind of landed on is that a cost is reasonable if it does not exceed that amount which a prudent person would incur or pay under circumstances at the time that the decision was made to kind of make that purchase. And so the way that you can frame the current circumstances by having documentation. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a lot of price gouging for cleaning supplies or PPE, when you were purchasing Lysol for 2-3 times as much, well, you would need documentation to show, hey, we went to 3 different vendors and all of them, were marked up at 3 times the normal cost. And so that's why we paid for, that Lysol at that price point. But if you're now incurring that same purchase, or you're purchasing Lysol today, that price point would likely be different. And so, the context at the time that the decision was made to make the purchase is super important, but the only way that you're able to show that context is through documentation. And we'll kind of get to that in the later parts of today's presentation. And that level of documentation to kind of determine reasonableness will vary depending on the type of procurement action or the method that you all utilize. And then to ensure fair and open competition is making sure that you're removing barriers to access and participation. And that applies to all of the procurement methods. So you want to just make sure that the price that's paid is fair, competitive, and reflective of the market price. Next slide, please. And so to ensure fair and open competition, there are 8 prohibitions which are listed here. So starting with organizational conflicts of interests, specifying only a brand name. And this one I think is important to highlight. When kind of creating your specifications or description of goods that you would like to purchase, you really need to start at the function of that good or service rather than the brand. So when we're thinking about a computer, we want to think about the specifications for the computer. Things like has the ability to connect to Wi-Fi, has a camera, has a microphone, hard drive space, RAM, so forth, rather than I want Apple MacBook Pro or whatever. You want to start at the features and the specifications needed for the hardware in order to allow for your agency to carry out the ESG CV activity. So thinking tablet versus iPad. You want to lean more towards the tablet and the specs that the tablet needs. Additional prohibitions, arbitrary actions in the procurement process, imposing geographical preferences, placing unreasonable requirements on firms to qualify, so that you are basically saying only this one firm that's extremely has these specific talents is now able to compete, and you've kind of eliminated the ability for other firms to also submit bids or quotes. So that also ties into requiring unnecessary experience or excessive bonding, as well as any non-competitive pricing practices, such as contracts to consultants on retainer as well. Next slide, please. So moving on to procurement methods. There are 4 main types of procurement. So the first is micro purchase, second is small purchase, third is a sealed bid, and then fourth is a competitive proposal. A micro purchase and a small purchase are any type of procurement action for purchases below the established kind of thresholds. Now, here, the thresholds that are noted on this slide are the federal thresholds. So any purchase of goods or supplies that is less than $10,000 in the aggregate, you could utilize the micro purchase procurement method. One further back. Anything below the $250,000 mark, you could utilize a small purchase procurement method. It is important to note, however, that your agency may have procurement policies with thresholds that are more stringent than the federal thresholds. And in those situations, you must comply with the more stringent of the two. So if your agency's micro purchase threshold is $15,000, you must comply with that $10,000 threshold when you're making purchases with federal funds, specifically things like ESG or ESGCV. If, however, your agency's procurement policies and procedures state, for micro purchases, the threshold is $5,000, well, then that's what your agency must comply with. And that's kind of that threshold. Similar situation for formal bids. It's really anything that's greater than $250,000 in the aggregate. And that is, again, the federal threshold. You should go back to your procurement guidelines, policies, and procedures for your agency to kind of verify whether or not that threshold is still accurate for you all. Next slide, please. So informal procurement is called or referred to as informal procurement because there is no requirement to publish a notice inviting bids or publish the desire to kind of purchase these goods and services. So for micro purchases, it allows for agencies to purchase goods, services that do not exceed $10,000 in the aggregate. And the idea for micro purchases is that you would distribute the purchase of those goods equitably amongst qualified suppliers or vendors. And then contracts and purchase orders could be awarded without, as I said, soliciting competitive proposals and not required to publish anything. For small purchases, very similar, except it's for the procurement of goods and services that don't exceed $250,000 in the aggregate. And in this situation, you're kind of obtaining quotes, whether it's oral, written, shopping carts, online, and documenting that you received an adequate number of quotes, which is generally about 3, to be able to show, there's 3 different vendors or providers. These were the loaded rates, and we kind of chose the vendor that was most reasonable in cost or lowest in cost. Obviously, you'll want to record the rate or quote received along with all of the vendor information, and then any of the quotes that were received from each of the 3 so that you can demonstrate the context under which you were making that purchase. If you were, looking for a contractor to do certain work, construction-related work, rehabilitation work, doing that procurement process 5 years ago versus today is going to look a lot different. And so the price points that you're paying are also going to reflect that change. But the only way to kind of allow somebody to view that context is by making sure that you maintain all of that documentation. Next slide, please. This slide is a little bit odd today, but the goal with this slide was to let you all know that the goal of the micro purchase procurement process is to kind of expedite the lowest dollar purchase transactions that don't exceed $10,000. So yes, having to notice and publish notice inviting bids, add some time to the process, reviewing kind of the bids. And the goal with micro purchase is to kind of reduce the amount of time that it takes by not requiring that. So you can go ahead and create your shopping carts with various vendors and make sure that they have all of that information. And you could actually go to the next slide, which will show us the 7 key steps or phases that you would go through when kind of utilizing the micro purchase. So if you're buying supplies, office supplies, let's say paper, pens, for your program, you're going to utilize them for applications. You could start by developing that list of items. So the supplies and materials, you've got your shopping cart. Identify a list of qualified vendors or suppliers. And so it's not just one. You usually want to get, 3 to 5. If it's office supplies, you could start with, an Office Max, an Amazon, Target. If you've got a local kind of office supply store, and then you'll perform a price analysis on that list of items, make sure that all of those vendors can provide you the office supplies at a reasonable price point. And then you'll finalize that list. And then as you need items, you will cycle through that list of vendors to make purchases. And that's extremely important because if you recall kind of in the introduction for micro purchases, a huge component is about equitably distributing those purchases to ensure fair and open competition. And so you can't always purchase from Office Depot the same office supplies and not distribute those purchases amongst other vendors that could provide you the same goods or services when utilizing the micro purchase procurement method. Once you've got that list, you'll issue the purchase orders. You can then make the purchases, and then you'll document all phases of the procurement action. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have a couple of a scenario to walk you through. So when the first step is to identify the items needed as well as the qualified vendors. So again, we need some office supplies. You could identify Office Max, Walmart, Amazon as qualified vendors that could provide you these goods. You'll conduct a price analysis, and really what that means is you could go onto officemax.com, fill up a shopping cart with the exact same goods and paper, pens, ink, toner. You'll go to Walmart, fill it up with the same exact shopping cart. So paper, pens, ink, toner. You'll go to Amazon, same exact shopping cart. Oop, we'll go back one. And once you have that shopping cart, you will attach all three, kind of do a print screen of all three to kind of show that the price between all three is reasonable. And then phase 2 to this process is to cycle through the vendors to purchase items. So in the first quarter, let's say you needed paper and ink, or they're running low, so you needed to go purchase them. You'll go to the first vendor on the list, which would be Office Max. A few months later, paper and ink is running low again. So the purchase for those supplies would occur from the next vendor, which is Walmart. And then the third time that you would need supplies, you would purchase them from Amazon. And the fourth time, you would go back up to the top, and you'd just keep cycling through those vendors to show that you distributed those purchases. And one of the caveats here is, people are like, well, what if the pen is actually cheaper from the previous vendor? It doesn't matter. The reason being is when you conducted the price analysis, you were able to determine that that same shopping cart amongst all three of these vendors was more or less the same price. And so as you're cycling through them, there's going to be a range, but they're more or less the same. And so really sticking to the order in which you're distributing them is much more important at this phase of the procurement process than redoing the analysis every time that you're trying to make a purchase. You did the analysis up front, and so now you're just cycling through. Next slide, please. Now for small purchases, again, the threshold is $250,000, and it doesn't require you to publish a solicitation for bids. Really, the competition occurs through oral or written quotes. So you could do cold calls, you could do emailing. If they offer kind of a shopping cart experience, that could work as well. And really, you just need to be able to document the adequate number of quotes. Recommended or best practice is 3. And you'll want to record all of the information. So what was the rate or the quote that you received, and then the vendor information, so name, address, phone number, website. And then contracts and purchase orders can be awarded to the lowest responsive bidder. Next slide, please. I'm seeing a question. Would you like me to address that one now? Let's see, how do I make this bigger? Okay, prices change in the micro purchase scenario. How often can we return to the price analysis stage to make sure all vendors still have reasonable prices? So would you be able to provide a little bit of context of like what types of items you're purchasing in that micro purchase scenario? So again, it's $10,000 in the aggregate. And so if you're having huge price swings for certain goods or items in that basket of goods, the major concern would be, would it exceed that $10,000 threshold as a result? If so, then you may want to explore the possibility of utilizing or implementing kind of a small purchase procurement process. In terms of, reasonable prices, we'd probably want to look at what specific items it is. And so maybe we can chat about that towards the end. But with respect to small purchases, this is kind of the workflow. There are 7 steps. So instead of just limiting it to kind of your basket of goods or items, you could develop a scope of work for services. You'll develop kind of your internal cost estimate. Then you'll draft the bid solicitation, distribute it to qualified vendors or suppliers, get at least 3 quotes from qualified vendors or suppliers. You'll award the contract to the lowest bidder. You'll administer the contract, receive the goods or services, and then you'll document all phases of the procurement action. Next slide, please. And so in this example, we have a couple of examples of small purchases, which is, first, if you needed some hardware, let's say it's HMIS activity, and you're looking to purchase new computers and printers at an ESG-CV HMIS center. And let's just say the total cost is more than $10,000. Then you would need to obtain 3 quotes or bids from qualified vendors to figure out what they can do in terms of their best deal for computers and printers based on certain specs. So again, it's not, I need an Apple computer, it's I need a computer with ability to connect to Wi-Fi, so much hard drive space, so much RAM, ability to run certain applications. And so if you're utilizing a specific application or program, there's obviously some requirements for certain softwares. And so you can look at those requirements and then say, okay, this system says the hardware has to meet these specific requirements. And that's really what you would send out to your vendors to say, hey, what's the best deal on a computer that meets this minimum criteria? You'll look at those 3 and then you'll kind of select the vendor that's lowest in price. Another example is a construction contract. So if the county needed to rehab a shelter to accommodate additional ESG-CV participants, let's say that rehab is less than $250,000, including contingency and change orders. And so that's a caveat or a nuance that we'll want to explore a little bit further. Because let's say your internal cost estimate is the rehab could cost about $240,000, and you get a bid from a contractor and they come in at $245,000. So it's more or less in range, and you're like, hey, that's below the $250,000 mark. That's great. However, if as the project is kind of in the implementation phase, there's change orders, and that change order amounts to more than $5,000 in our scenario, and it pushes you beyond that $250,000 threshold mark, then technically the small purchase procurement would be an insufficient procurement action. And so when you get close to these thresholds, it's always important to kind of take a step back and say, hey, do I have enough wiggle room for a contingency or a change order? If you're getting really close, sometimes it's better to just elevate it to the next level of procurement, such as a sealed bid or contracted price, which we'll kind of get into next. But if you feel very confident that it'll be below the $250,000, this is definitely a good option for you all to explore. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, documentation are really the keys to this. On the left box, we have kind of the 5 pieces of documentation that you'll need with respect to the micro purchase procurement process or method. And then on the right box, we have kind of the 7 pieces of documentation that you'll need for small purchases. So under micro purchase, it's the list of items. So your hypothetical shopping cart, is it 8.5 by 11 paper, certain printer, ink or toner, the price analysis, which is the shopping cart. And it could be a printout of those various shopping carts from the variety of qualified vendors that you all are sourcing from. And then any contract and or purchase order. Sometimes for supplies, you're not really entering into a contract, but rather you have a purchase order, an internal agency purchase order that's issued. And then obviously you'll have invoices or receipts and then the proof of payment. And then under small purchase, you'll kind of have that scope of work or services. You'll have your internal independent cost estimate. You'll get the bid solicitation. Hopefully you get at least 3. Again, then you'll get into the contract and or purchase order. You'll have an invoice or receipt and then the proof of payment. And we have a few examples of that on the next few slides. So here on the left, we have a sample of a micro purchase form. And then on the right, a sample of a small purchase procurement form. As you'll notice, starting with number 1 on both, it is your basket of goods, the list of items, the description, the specification. And again, you're really trying to get at the functionality of the good or service. If we want to move away from the iPad scenario, you could talk about, shirts, rain resistant kind of jackets. And having that level of specification says anything that is a rain kind of repellent jacket is sufficient to meet that specification, meaning could you find that at Walmart? If so, then that's who you need to go with rather than, going on a ball down Rodeo Drive and finding the most expensive rain jacket you can. And so that's why you want to get down to the specifications. Then you'll list the minimum number of vendors needed. So in this case, for micro purchase, this form has 5 potential vendors. And so this is the situation where you're kind of rotating through them. So starting at the top for first purchase, second purchase, you'll go to the next vendor, third, so on and so forth. And then once you reach the last one, you'll go to the top. Versus in the small purchase, you'll notice on portion 2, you're getting the vendors and then their total contract price, because you are making this decision up front and going with one vendor under a small purchase, whereas under micro purchase, you're kind of cycling through. And then obviously third, that's super important, is making sure that it's signed and dated by the appropriate officials within your agency. And the date is super important here because the portion of the procurement regulations that's extremely important is that you have to go through this exercise before you make the purchase. It does you no good to purchase a computer today, then go through the internet or find some vendors that could sell you a computer. And really at that point, it's too late. And there's really only two outcomes. Outcome number one is you were lucky and you picked the right vendor and actually did get a good deal. But in the worst case scenario, you got fleeced and you actually overpaid to a certain vendor for, the same laptop or computer that you could have gotten from somebody else at a, reduced price. And so going through this exercise before you make the purchase is extremely important. So that date at the bottom of this is something that HUD would definitely look at when they're monitoring. Next slide, please. And so again, these are examples of the kind of invoice and or kind of purchase order that you'd get from the vendor. They don't all look the same, but they'll contain specific information that is essential. So number one is the date that the order occurred. And so if I'm looking at this, we would want to make sure that the date on this invoice is after the date that was noted on the procurement pages, so the last slide. The second thing that these two have in common, even though they look different, is the level of detail in that it's an itemized receipt. So it gives us the quantity and a description of what was being purchased, what the unit price, as well as what the total price was. And you'll notice that's true for both of these. And then third is kind of that total price, including any sales tax. And sometimes if there's like a rebate or a discount, that would be included there as well. And the goal there is to verify that the amount charged to the ESG CV program or ESG award is actually equal to the total. And so if you got a discount, you don't just get to keep the discounted difference for yourself. We're just paying what the order total is minus any discounts. Next slide, please. And then to kind of tie everything together, you would have kind of your payment request or your purchase order. And again, we'd be looking at the invoice number or the purchase order number, making sure that the description matches, that the quantity and the unit price matches, and again, that the date that it was signed is after the procurement documentation. And then when we look at the check, we will also be, or any other proof of payment, we'll be looking at the date that the check was issued and confirming that the amount that is listed on the check is also the amount listed in the invoice or receipt. And then lastly, inside your general ledger, there should be that same connection. So the check number connects to that same amount. So this 124.54 is kind of carried through all the way from the ledger, proof of payment, invoice, purchase order and procurement documents. But that way you can kind of see how that trail gets left behind and what somebody would be looking for. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to formal procurement. So the last two that we talked about were informal. This is now formal. And there's two methods under formal as well. So you've got sealed bids and competitive proposals. Both of these require the publication of a bid or an RFP or similar instrument. And so that's why they're referred to as formal. And that's really to encourage competition, ensure everybody has, a level playing field to submit a bid. They're very aware of, what's being asked of them, when they need to submit a bid, have sufficient time to put together all of the information that you requested. And each one of these methods kind of is used for different scenarios. So sealed bids, for instance, are primarily used to procure construction contracts, whereas competitive proposals are primarily used to procure service contracts when sealed bids are not feasible. Next slide, please. So with sealed bids, you'll want to ensure that the conditions for sealed bids are met. And so part of that is ensuring that you get the minimum number of required vendors, which is at least 2. And you want to make sure that when you publish the notice that there is sufficient time for those vendors to prepare their bids. You must have the minimum number of responsive bidders competing for a contract, which again is 2. And as part of those solicitations or publications, you want to include 3 key pieces of information. Number 1, what it is that you're purchasing or what service it is that you're looking for. The terms and conditions that the vendors must meet. So if there's any federal cross-cutting requirements, that's extremely important, especially when you're dealing with a construction contract. Does it have, the federal and state labor standards, Section 3 standards if it applies, and so forth. And then when and where sealed bids will be opened. So the date that they're due, when they'll be open, and so forth. And then awards must be made to the lowest price responsible vendor capable of complying with all the bid specifications and capable of performing the work. So the award becomes a firm fixed price contract. And that's why your scope of work is super important. You don't want to leave it very open-ended so that the bids that you are receiving, you're really able to compare apples to apples rather than getting a mix of bids that don't really get you to being able to make that decision because you still feel there's a little bit of missing information. Next slide, please. So here again, sealed bid workflow, the 7 steps. Here you'll kind of start by developing the scope of work or services, the internal cost estimate. You'll review all of the procurement documents to ensure that the conditions for using the sealed bid method are met. Draft the bid solicitation, publish it. You'll conduct the sealed bid opening, then evaluate the bids, select the successful bidder, which under this process is the one that's least costly. Then you'll execute the contract and administer the contract. And in certain situations, agencies will have kind of a pre-bid meeting or a pre-construction meeting to make sure that all of the players involved are on the same page. So sometimes pre-bid meeting is very useful to make sure you're not getting bids from contractors that are unaware of what they're signing up for. So letting them know that they may have to pay prevailing wages at the state or federal prevailing rate before they submit a bid is really important. Otherwise, you may get a bid that doesn't account for that price. And so then you're already getting into a change order situation, or they feel like you were not honest up front. And so that's also why it's super important. That's in the bid solicitation. Everyone being on the same page is really key from the start so that you kind of have a smooth project once you're through the contract execution phase. Next slide, please. And so here we have a couple of sealed bid examples. I'll go through one just because we're running up on time. So one of them is an example of a county needing to expand the existing kitchen and dining facilities at an emergency shelter to be able to accommodate the increased number of clientele. And so in that situation, you would want to make sure that your bid solicitation contains the exact specifications for the needed improvements. So if you are expanding the square footage, what is the square footage? How much drywall do you need? Is it going to need some electrical work, some plumbing work? All of those things are extremely important. You're probably going to need some roofing. Is it going to be a shingles roof? Is it going to be a metal roof? Getting down to that level of detail is important because you may have one contractor that is going to say, hey, we use shingles roof, and another one that says, well, a metal sheath roof will be sufficient. And that's why you're getting 2 quotes that are completely different. And so making sure that, again, you're able to compare apples to apples is super important. Next slide, please. For competitive proposals, very similar to a sealed bid. There are a few types of competitive proposal methods that you can kind of follow. So you could do a request for proposal or RFP, a request for qualifications or RFQ, as well as a request for information or RFI. And again, this is to be published, which is very similar to the sealed bid method. And all evaluation factors are publicized and their importance. You still must have the minimum number of responsive firms competing for the contract, so at least 2. But when we talk about additional factors, it's not just price anymore. And so instead of price, the award is made to the most responsive firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the program, meaning that other factors besides price can be determined. And an example of this is architectural and engineering services. You may not want to go with the cheapest architectural and engineering firm for obvious reasons. And so experience or prior qualifications and projects that an architectural and engineering firm have done may be important. And so listing out what those criteria are and how each one of the bidders will be evaluated via those factors is super important as well. Because those criteria can then be utilized as a reason for awarding that contract. Next slide, please. So here we have the competitive proposals workflow. Again, similar 7 steps to the sealed bids, where you're developing the scope of work, doing the internal cost estimate, making sure you're selecting the appropriate procurement method, whether it's RFP, RFQ, or RFI, drafting that bid solicitation. You'll get solicit bids after you publish it, evaluate the bids. And again, in this situation, selecting the successful bidder may not be limited to price. Price is certainly a consideration because price reasonableness. However, additional criteria, factors, experience, or qualifications may be utilized to determine what a successful bidder is and looks like. And then you'll negotiate the contract, execute it, and administer that contract. And so in terms, oh, that was actually pretty good. Go to that next one. Sweet. So some examples of competitive proposals: consultant for administrative services. If you're looking for a consulting firm to assist you with the day-to-day kind of administration and implementation of any one of your ESG, ESGCV programs, you likely should have published an RFP, kind of specifying the types of services, ESG, ESGCV admin, or if they're implementing, an activity, kind of discussing what that scope of work is. The other example would be an architectural and engineering firm. So, not just price is going to be evaluated. You may be evaluating, their qualifications as architects, as engineers, to ensure that the service that's being provided is, adequate. Next slide, please. And again, it really all comes down to documentation. So in the box on the left, we have kind of the documentation required for sealed bids. And then in the box on the right, the level of documentation that you would want for your competitive proposals. So starting with sealed bids, you'll have your advertisement or where you published it. Generally, if you could get the affidavit from the publishing house, that's a lot better than just submitting the Word document of like, oh yeah, this was our notice inviting bids. Then you'll have your independent cost estimate. And so some of this can pull on previous works. So if you've had an engineer or a contractor do work in the past for a similar type of rehab, you can pull on, hey, last time we did something similar size or scope, these were the estimates we got. And so that could be your independent cost estimate. Then the type of contract, scoring, including adherence to the solicitation. So if you're asking them about Section 3, about Davis-Bacon or any of the state labor standards, and then you need to document the basis for why you selected a particular contractor and rejected the other. So if it's just coming down to price, you can say, well, their bid responded to each of the requirements and was lowest in price. And so that is the basis for contractor selection. And then you would be able to have that price or cost analysis there, as well as the basis for award and contract amount. And then competitive proposals is very, very similar. The major difference, again, for competitive proposals is that you'll likely have some additional factors besides price that you want vendors to be responding to. And so that is another kind of criterion or factor that you could utilize in terms of the basis for award or the contract amount. Next slide, please. And that just about wraps us up. Just for everyone else's reference, the procurement requirements can be accessed there at 2 CFR 200 subpart D. So once you have access to the slide deck, if you click on it, it's hyperlinked and should be made available to everyone. And if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes now. Else, I'm sure you can contact your grant administrators or program reps, and they'd be happy to help as well.
Thank you, David. We do have just a couple minutes. If there's anyone else that has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Not seeing anything in the chat right now. David, we do thank you for much clarity that I know is needed, for all communities. Procurement is always such a hefty task, and making sure that it's done correctly. And for things that we didn't know, you definitely provided more insight or provided better insight for us today. So we really appreciate that.
Happy to help.
Well, no one is coming off mute and asking a question, so we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks again, David. Thank you everyone for attending today. Remember, as usual, once this presentation ends, there will be a short survey. So if you would please take a minute or two to answer it for us. And we'll see you not next week because we have a break, but we'll see you the week after. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.